In this video, I'll be ranking every mainline Pokemon game from best to worst. Now, Pokemon games have changed a lot over the years, and recent entries feel almost unrecognizable from previous games. So that's why in this video, I want to go over the long journey of every mainline Pokemon video game and give my thoughts and place them on this tier list. So for some context, I've been playing Pokemon games for over 25 years. My first ever Pokemon game was Pokemon Gold when I was 5 years old, and since then, I've literally gone back and played the older games and played each new Pokemon game on release multiple times. So that's why I want to carefully craft this list and ultimately give you my opinion on what I feel the best Pokemon games are and my reasoning behind them. So let's start with Generation 1 for Red, Blue, and Yellow, released in 1998. Now, Generation 1 were the games that started the franchise, and the games were incredible for their time, but of course, they can be a little bit challenging to revisit now, as these games were filled with a lot of bizarre bugs and glitches, but they do have their charm and they are very important for Pokemon's gaming history. Red, Blue, Yellow, they all are kind of that same line of game. Pokemon Yellow did update a lot, but in terms of Pokemon Red and Blue, these were definitely the game's starting points. Now, at this point, it should be said that Pokemon is kind of finding their feet with how popular it's going to be, because Pokemon had no idea how popular it would become. Remember, right? This was their first kind of trial ground. Even in the Pokemon TCG, when Pokemon cards initially came out, when base set released, they really had no idea how popular Pokemon would become. A lot of corner cutting happened with these games, and probably they didn't have such big budgets to work with like future games. And even though it did take the world by storm and everyone became obsessed with Pokemon, it still had that kind of new game energy or new franchise feel about it. Though what they kind of did achieve with the games was incredible as well, and I think Kanto is such a recognizable generation. And they obviously did something right, because Kanto got revisited a lot of times. I mean, Fire Red and Leaf Green, and same with the Pokemon Let's Go games. I mean, people really enjoyed Kanto. And of course, even with Pokemon Gold and Silver, you did revisit Kanto as well, which I will be going over in a second. Now, for Pokemon Red and Blue, they were great games for their era, but they did still have some issues there. So for Pokemon Red and Blue in particular, I'm going to be putting these in the B tier. Now with Pokemon Yellow though, that had a lot of updates. Now obviously you don't actually choose a starter in Pokemon Yellow, you actually get gifted Pikachu and it does follow you. So that was a really cool introduction, and it was the first time we had Pokemon follow you as well, which was really cool. Though a thing I really love about Pokemon Yellow is the fact that you can actually get Bulbasaur, Squirtle, and Charmander all in your team naturally without trading. They did have options to get every starter Pokemon, which is very rare for a mainline Pokemon game. Usually to get the starter Pokemon, you do always need to kind of trade with friends. But Pokemon Yellow is the kind of best version you can play from Generation 1, especially for those older games. And for Pokemon Yellow, it did make Generation 1 go that next level above. So for that reason, it does go into the A tier. Like I said, Pokemon Red, Blue were okay. Pokemon Yellow updated a lot. I did love the follow behind mechanics, and I also love that you can get every starter within those games as well. Now, moving on to Generation 2 for Gold, Silver, and Crystal, which released in 1999 for Japan and the 2000s for North America and Europe. It was kind of weird because back then when games came out in Japan, sometimes, fans had to wait like a year for game releases. Though, the Generation 2 games were huge upgrades, and they also had some very clever optimization, which allowed both the Johto region and Kanto region to fit on the same cartridge. This was huge for the time, man, because, the Game Boy Color, people were so excited for Generation 2. Pokemon was really building its brand identity at this point. A lot of people loved it. A lot of people were excited for the next kind of region, okay? And when it came out, it really delivered. And Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal, I kind of put them all on the same playing field. Even though Pokemon Crystal did have some updates, I don't think the updates were that big that it kind of makes you look at Pokemon Gold and Silver and say, wow, Crystal is the definitive version. I think they're all really good. In terms of these games though, you had so many cool things introduced. The new evolutions that Generation 2 introduced, also Pokemon could now hold items as well, and the same with shiny Pokemon. I mean, the Gen 2 games really did a lot, and people still look back at Generation 2 as the best games of the series. And this was the first game that I ever started. So for Gold and Silver, I'm definitely putting those in S tier. And the same thing goes with Pokemon Crystal as well. Yes, it is technically the better version, but like I said, the upgrades were not something that I go, wow, oh, I can't play Gold and Silver as well. I think I can play all three games and still really enjoy them still to this day, which is very rare for such an old game. Now also I want to say, if you have been enjoying this video, my name is Phil and I run this Pokemon gaming and lore channel. Feel free to subscribe for future content. It's always amazing seeing new people on board the channel. Now, Generation 3 includes Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, and these were iconic GBA games for their time, and again, they were massive upgrades from Generation 2 in the best ways possible. Generation 3 introduced a lot, including weather mechanics, along with new ways to traverse the map. Now, you probably noticed I said they were huge upgrades, but of course, that upgrade only could happen because of the massive upgrade from Game Boy Color to Game Boy Advance, and we rarely get these big generational leaps like we do now. Like even when we look at the PS4 versus the PS5, yes, it's a big leap, but you know, most PS5 games are still being played on the PS4. Same thing with the Nintendo Switch and the Switch 2. Yes, the Switch 2 is a big upgrade from the Nintendo Switch, but then again, it's not something like, wow, this is like so groundbreaking like the jump from like, you know, Game Boy Color to Game Boy Advance. Game Boy Advance really was a massive kind of jump. But you know, these games are very nostalgic and they were really, really good as well. You know, and these games are actually quite difficult as well. Pokemon Emerald is definitely the definitive version of how you want to play these games. But Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire are definitely A-tier Pokemon games. And for Pokemon Emerald, that 100% goes into the S tier. I just think all the introductions it introduced, including Pokemon's abilities, the double battle mechanics, the weather mechanics, the new upgrades in terms of the battle frontier, Generation 3 as a whole is amazing. And of course, like I said, Ruby and Sapphire are great. They go in the A tier, but Emerald is the best way to play these games, and that pushes it to the S tier. Now, moving on to Generation 4, which was Pokemon Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum. Now, Generation 4 really was incredible and had some amazing new features, plus the DS hardware really showed off just how good Pokemon games could be. Now, don't forget, when the Nintendo DS released, that was also a massive generational leap from the GBA. Now, here's the interesting thing that happened at this point. Pokemon was finding its feet on how to work with the Nintendo DS, and I did make a previous video talking about Pokemon Dash, which was the first Pokemon Nintendo DS game to release, and it was a really big failure. Though in terms of Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, these games were iconic, dude. So many new features, so many cool ways to interact with the game, like with honey trees, the exploration, the underground, it was awesome. Some annoying things about these games was the kind of slowness of them. The games really take a long time to complete. So, you know, you're easily looking at 40 to 50 hours to play these games. And there's a really annoying thing when you have like a Pokemon with high HP. If you battle it, it takes such a long time for the health bar to go down. And that was spread across Generation 4 games, which was a little bit annoying. And another thing that was kind of a drawback of Pokemon Pearl and Pokemon Diamond was the fact that a lot of the new Pokemon evolutions that were introduced, because no other generation had so many buffs for existing Pokemon. You know, you had Rhyperior get introduced, Magmortar, Electivire, you know, so many Pokemon got third stage evolutions. Though the annoying thing is, a lot of the items to actually evolve these Pokemon were all locked behind the post game. So that kind of makes you feel like, hey, I want to use these Pokemon in my team, but I can't unlock it until the end of the game, which is really disappointing to see. But no, these games were definitely incredible and they go in the A tier. However, for Pokemon Platinum, that's where everything from Pokemon Diamond and Pearl that was amazing got bumped up. If you want to play the Generation 4 games on DS, you don't need to play Pokemon Diamond or Pearl. You can play Pokemon Platinum and get the definitive experience. And for Pokemon Platinum, that is 100% S tier. And you can see early Pokemon games, how many are already in S tier. And you may be thinking, Phil, you're being so generous here, dude. Well, I'm actually not, because Pokemon games were all so well designed at this point. And that's what I mean. Pokemon was at the top of their game at this point. That's why the IP is this big today, literally because of the run they had from these early Pokemon games. You know, everything that they delivered was so well created. In terms of their mainline games, they had no missteps. There was just like banger after banger. And this is how Pokemon became so iconic like it is today, because of this generation, okay? Because of this era and how good their run was, that's what made Pokemon become so iconic. So we can't really forget that as well. Now, moving on to Gen 5, which included Black, White, and Black, White 2. Now, Generation 5 was a complete rebrand from the Pokemon franchise, and in a way, it did feel like a soft reboot, because over 156 new Pokemon were introduced, and it provided a lot more Pokemon, and more than that, it also provided hidden abilities for Pokemon. A lot of the people that grew up with Pokemon games, by the time Generation 5 released, a lot of them were older. I even know for myself, when Generation 5 came out, I was 16 years old, so I was a teenager at this point, but my older brother also played Pokemon games, back in the day, but he would have been 20 years old. So a lot of my older brother's generation that, played Pokemon Gold and Silver and, played Pokemon Emerald, they were now in their 20s. So Generation 5 knew what it had to do. And same with Pokemon. They knew, hey, we need to do a little bit of a rebrand, a little bit of a soft reboot, and bring in a new audience because the older audience is getting older, which is very true at that time. The base game was definitely good. It did have some nice visual upgrades. It definitely felt like an amazing DS game. Catching the Pokemon in Generation 5 was really great, and the story was really good as well. Though I do feel the Pokemon formula at this point started becoming very cookie cutter, and even though we all love the Pokemon formula, I feel this was the generation when they did experiment with the Pokemon, but they didn't experiment enough with the formula of Pokemon games, and I felt fans really felt it at that point. So for this reason, the base games do go in B tier. Now, Pokemon Black, White 2 were complete different games, and this game probably pushed the Nintendo DS to its maximum capacity, and of course, Black, White 2 had the peak of Pokemon sprite designs. I do think at this point, it has become very nostalgic as well, and of course, it did upgrade a lot, and the story got even better in Black, White 2. I think Pokemon Black, White 2 were the peak of how good Pokemon games could look on the Nintendo DS. For this, it is a very enjoyable game to play, especially if you're just traversing the map, catching Pokemon. You will have a real good time with this video game. For this reason, they do go in the A tier. Now, moving on to Generation 6 for the 3DS era, which was Pokemon X and Y. Now, this was when Pokemon actually moved to the 3D era and sprites left the design completely, though it also was the era which introduced Mega Evolution. Now, this is a little bit of an awkward period for Pokemon because they left the sprite design. Now, a lot of people say, oh, but Pokemon should have never left sprite designs. They should have kept them. But here's the issue. It's kind of like, oh, if Pokemon zigged, they should have zagged, because at this point, they really had to update it because they could see that the sales of Black, White and Black, White 2, they weren't amazing for Pokemon standards. So they needed to do something to really refresh the franchise. And the graphics of Pokemon X and Y are pretty disappointing. This is where I feel Pokemon took a turn for the worst, and this is probably the 3D era hasn't been kind to Pokemon. Pokemon X and Y play okay. They do feel like a little bit of a slog to get through, and even when you're playing the game, even though it did introduce Mega Evolution, that kind of pulled the game up. The introduction of Mega Evolutions made the games probably seem a little bit more excitable than they were, but in terms of a Pokemon game, I feel like this was their first time exploring in a 3D era for a Pokemon game. And even though they were okay, and if you go back to them, you will enjoy it because it still is a Pokemon game, I don't think you're gonna have the best experience because there's a big learning curve that Game Freak was going through here, and it didn't really deliver. So for this reason, they go in the C tier. The amazing introductions of Mega Evolution was really awesome, but again, it didn't really do enough. Now, Generation 7 was Pokemon Sun, Moon, and Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, and this was a very exciting generation, though little did we know that this was the last time that a mainline Pokemon game would let you catch and complete a complete Pokedex. Generation 7 also introduced Z moves, and Mega Evolution was available in the post game. Now, Generation 7 was a real fresh and exciting generation for me because, the whole Alola kind of Hawaiian inspired environment was really cool. It felt really fresh, really summery, super tropical kind of game, and it really fitted Pokemon well at this time. Generation 4 to Generation 5 was probably the most similar a Pokemon games have been in terms of their look and feel, whereas from Generation 6 to Generation 7, it was a big difference in the feeling of the game. And there were big graphical upgrades as well, and it does look much more polished than Generation 6. Though I didn't really like Z moves, I felt out of all the Pokemon gimmicks introduced, they were the weakest. Oh man, the story in these games is just such a drag. You gotta just like mash A sometimes. You get so annoyed with the story. But it did introduce a few cool things like SOS battles as well. It wasn't the biggest upgrade of a game, but then again, I do think the 3DS era for Pokemon games was also pretty lackluster. For the base versions of Sun and Moon, I'm putting them in B tier. Now, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon didn't do much in terms of like a whole sequel, but it kind of just refreshed the whole game in a big way, and I really did enjoy these. The Pokedex and the amount of Pokemon that you can catch in Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon is huge, dude. There is so many Pokemon. It is a long game as well. You can have a lot of fun with it. There's a few quality of life improvements, and the charm some of the game's still there, but of course it's kind of bigger and bolder as well. Also, something I didn't mention, that Generation 7 moved away from the gym formula, which was a pretty big deal. In terms of Generation 7, if you do want to play the generation, there's really no reason to play the base versions. Playing Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon is definitely the definitive experience, and I think they're actually really awesome games with all the upgrades and all the massive Pokemon, and they go in A tier. Now, moving on to Generation 8 Sword and Shield, along with the DLCs. Now, Sword and Shield is arguably Pokemon's most controversial generation, as they cut the Pokedex, and the initial game had around 400 Pokemon available, which was pretty inexcusable. The DLCs did add some polish, though Generation 8 was famous for Dynamax and Gigantamax, and it provided some unique benefits for competitive Pokemon. Now, Generation 8, I've always had a bit of sympathy for it because it kind of got introduced. It was the first time that Pokemon split away from handheld, and mainline games were now coming on the Nintendo Switch. And that means you could traverse the map, and it was on the TV, and it was a big deal, right? Now, Pokemon Sword and Shield in the base version was a pretty bad game, dude, okay? It was so boring. It just did not have any flair about it. The amount of Pokemon that got cut from the Pokedex was huge. The story was really drawn out as well, and it got really annoying. Though I really like Gigantamax, what I like and what I think Pokemon Sword and Shield did really well was the competitive Pokemon. When you add the DLCs into Pokemon Sword and Shield, that's when it becomes a fully complete game. And here's the thing, right? If you ask me where I would rank Pokemon Sword and Shield without the DLCs, it would go in the C tier. When you add the DLCs of Sword and Shield, the amount of Pokemon it actually allowed you to bring back in, it kind of felt with Sword and Shield's DLCs, you did get a complete game. And I really, really enjoy Pokemon Sword and Shield. I actually think as a whole package, it is one of the best Pokemon games you can play. And what I liked about Sword and Shield, it didn't try play out of its league like Scarlet and Violet did, which I'll explain in a moment. But, you know, Game Freak knew the Switch's limitations. They didn't try push it above that. And because of that, you do get a real fun game when you play it. And in terms of competitive Pokemon, I don't think competitive Pokemon has ever been as good as it was like in Pokemon Sword and Shield. In terms of all the games with the DLCs, I actually put Pokemon Sword and Shield in A tier. I do think it was an amazing game. The initial base version really does feel underwhelming, but when you do have the Isle of Armor and Crown Tundra DLCs and you get to play it in all its glory, it becomes an amazing game. So for that reason, as a total package, it goes in the A tier. Now, the most recent generation is Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, along with the DLCs. Now, this generation introduced the Terastallized phenomenon, and this generation has had a fair bit of anger, specifically around the game's performance. Here we go, Scarlet and Violet. Now, this is a really interesting era because in terms of other areas, Scarlet and Violet has performed amazing in areas outside of the games. Though in terms of the games, these games are straight up really poor performing, especially where most people played them on the Nintendo Switch. Now, if you do have a Nintendo Switch 2, you can play the 60 frames per second 4K version, and that's kind of the definitive way to play the game. But here's the thing, even when you play it in 4K 60 FPS, the textures and the kind of models of everything still look so subpar. So even though it runs better, you're still looking at a game that just looks like it had no effort placed into it. The Pokemon introduced in this generation were awesome, but it did have so many issues. And because of the performance and how bad the games ran, it was kind of wild that such a big IP could release a game in this state. Even with the DLCs, it was pretty lackluster. For this reason, Pokemon Sword and Shield goes in the D tier. In terms of the best Pokemon game of all time, it actually isn't on this list because it is Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, though that was a remake, so for that reason, I've kind of left it as the base games. Though Pokemon games have always been special to a lot of people. Though after making this list, it does make you wonder, what is the hardest Pokemon to obtain in every game? And I actually reveal the answer to that in this video here. Within this video, I go over the hardest Pokemon to catch in every game. Feel free to click on the video on screen, and I'll see you on the next video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel